Hello and welcome back, ladies and gents. We are going to continue our unit on Norse culture, literature, and mythology. And last time we finished up a brief discussion, a brief introduction to Norse mythology and a few pieces of its literature. But now we're going to get into its literature proper by looking at the story of Sigurd, Sigurd and Fafnir. Now, Sigurd, his story is set within a larger framework that includes a conflict between the gods and the dwarves, and then later on a sort of romantic pursuit and subsequent conflict between Sigurd and Brunhilde. Now, we're not going to get into Sigurd and Brunhilde entirely, but what I want to do today is take a close look at Sigurd's conflict with the dragon Fafnir. Now, this is our first dragon slayer, our first dragon conflict that we're looking at in this class. And so it deserves a little bit of attention, therefore, just because dragon slaying, monster combat is so prevalent in ancient literature that we really, could have an entire class on it. So I want to look at Sigurd briefly, discuss some of the elements that we see at play and some of the symbols we see being woven into his story, and then just kind of talk about and analyze it a little bit before we end and then eventually move on. Now, if you're following along with our notes, this is somewhat out of order because typically I'll do the Greek or the Norse creation story, then talk about Sigurd, and then do Ragnarok. But I wanted to do the creation and Ragnarok story sort of at the beginning of this. So we're going to take a pause now and look at Sigurd's story. So let's begin by the Red Fairy book version, by the way, up here. So if you want to know the full version of his story, go grab Andrew Lang's Red Fairy book, and it will give you a really, really good rendition of this story. So, begins here. Now, there was at that time a dwarf called Andvari, who lived in a pool beneath a waterfall. And there he had hidden a great hoard of gold. And one day, Otter had been fishing there and had killed a salmon and eaten it and flayed off its skin and took it to the house. I'm sorry, and was sleeping like an otter on a stone. Then someone came by and threw a stone at the otter and killed it and flayed off the skin and took it to the house of Otter's father. Then he knew that Otter's father knew his son was dead. And to punish the person who had killed him, he said he must have Otter's skin filled with gold and covered all over with red gold, or it should go worse with him. Then the person who had killed Otter went down and caught the dwarf who owned all the treasure and took it from him. Only one ring was left, which the dwarf wore, and even that was taken from him. Then the poor dwarf was very angry, and he prayed that the gold might never bring any but bad luck to all the men who might own it forever. Then the otter's skin was filled with gold and covered with gold, all but one hair, and that was covered with the dwarf's last ring. Okay, so a couple things to begin with. Again, we're beginning a little bit after the original story's discussion of the how these dwarves got here, how these elements came into play. But we know that there was the killing of this being called Otter, who was in the form of an otter. And as a result of his killing and his skinning, his father demands what is called a weregild, which is essentially a repayment in monetary terms and in gold for the death of his son. Okay, so that's a typical concept of what's called a weregild. So if you kill someone in the kind of Nordic cultures and the Anglo-Saxon cultures, you would have to pay a weregild. You would have to pay back somehow in some equivalent to that being's or that person's worth. Now, perceived worth, I should say. So who killed Otter, by the way? Most myths say, or most versions of the story will tell you that it was Loki. It was Loki who killed Otter, and therefore springs on, as he always does, all of the domino-like negative effects of this particular story. So either way, someone kills the dwarf, or I'm sorry, kills Otter, and as a result, they have to go and acquire the gold that will act as a weregild for this. Now, to acquire this gold, they steal it from the dwarf Andvari, and Andvari, in his anger, curses his ring, the one ring that was left to him. Now, As a side note, and we will talk about this in my fantasy class in more detail, this is not the sole or even necessarily the major inspiration for the Lord of the Rings and the One Ring. The notion of having a ring that is the source of negativity, that general motif is more of the inspiration. But if my students are paying attention here, you'll be able to raise your hand and point out, wait a minute, no, that concept, this concept of a ring, a gold little ring object, causing issues and causing trouble and corrupting people, that actually comes from Socrates in the discussion with Gyges, or in the discussion about Gyges' ring. So careful. We don't want to make flippant or kind of simplistic connections here. So here we go. The skin was filled, the dwarf ring. Okay, here. But it brought, that is the gold, brought good luck to nobody. First, Fafnir, the dragon, killed his own father. And then he went and wallowed on the gold and would let his brother have none, and no man dared go near it. When Sigurd heard the story, he said to Regin, which is a dwarf, who was a dwarf, make me a good sword that I may kill this dragon. So Regin made a sword and Sigurd tried it. So before we get to this, the construction of Sigurd's sword, let's talk about this real quick. These two little lines here. The gold is sort of sitting and dwelling in the forest, and the father who was given it, the father of Otter, has two other children, and that is Fafnir and then this other unnamed brother. Actually, it's Regin. Regin is the other brother. Now, after being given all this gold, the being, the son, Fafnir, the brother of Otter, desires the gold and then kills his father for it. So he commits patricide, a really ancient sin. He does this. He goes and takes the gold, and then as a result of these actions, he is transfigured, is devolved into a dragon, into a beast, into a monster. Okay, so it's an important point. The first time that we see a dragon in this course, in kind of ancient Western literature, it is a deeply, deeply negative thing associated with monstrous and immoral familial behavior. And it wallows on the gold, right? It sort of just sits on top of the gold and just does nothing with it, hoards it for no reason. Now, this is sort of, kind of an ancient motif as well, is what is it that we do with our hoards of gold? And it's a fun discussion I like to have with my students when, I ask them, at the end of your life, let's say you have this hoard of gold, like you see your death approaching, but you have, these billions of dollars of gold. What do you do with it? The dragon response is basically keep it and let it die, let me die with it, let no one have it. Whereas a lot of other people would say, give it to my, inheritors, give it to my successors. Other people would say, give it to charity, give it away. So we see the dragon mentality, the demonic mentality, the immoral mentality is to cling on to it, no matter what. Okay, so Fafnir does this. Fafnir's brother Regin, who is the third brother out of Otter, Fafnir, and then Regin, leaves his family, obviously, after this, but desires the gold still and desires some kind of vengeance on Fafnir. So he finds Sigurd, who is this young warrior, this young boy who he adopts. And Sigurd hears the story from Regin about this dragon Fafnir and the gold. And Sigurd's like, okay, let's make me a sword that I may kill this dragon, right? So Regin made a sword. And Sigurd tried it with a blow on a lump of iron, and the sword broke. Another sword he made, and Sigurd broke that too. Then Sigurd went to his mother and asked for the broken pieces of his father's blade and gave them to Regin, and he hammered and wrought them into a new sword so sharp that fire seemed to burn along the edges. Sigurd tried this blade on a lump of iron, and it did not break, but split the iron in two. Then he threw a lock of wool down the river, and it floated down against the sword and was cut in two pieces. So Sigurd said that the sword would do. But before he went against the dragon, he led an army to fight men who had killed his father, and he slew their king and took all his wealth and went home. Okay, so we have here the construction of Sigurd's sword. I think it's named Graham. I can't remember the exact name of it. But the sword is forged from the broken pieces of his father's sword. That's a very typical archetypal, or very, typical archetypal. It's a very usual archetypal motif there. the inheriting of one's father's weapons, or the passing down of a weapon and then the enhancing of that weapon. We see that, my Star Wars fans will know that, of course, like Luke Skywalker gets Anakin's lightsaber, so on and so forth. Uther Pendragon gives the sword Excalibur, or essentially gives the sword Excalibur to, or the sword and stone to Arthur as he grows up, depending on the story. Here we have the same thing. We have the need for a father's sword. And I usually ask my students, why? Why do you need your father's sword in order to do this? Is it magical? Is it a magical sword? No, it's not. So what is the storyteller doing here? I think it's basically just an obvious symbol of the need for recovery, the need to recover one's father's wisdom, the need to recover the past in some sense. Simba needs the wisdom of Mufasa to move forward. Luke needs his father's lightsaber to move forward. Same thing here. Sigurd needs his father's past wisdom and experience to move forward, just like Pinocchio requires Geppetto, etc., etc., etc. So he takes his father's sword. Notice it's broken, right? And he reforges it in his own way. So it is kind of a nice fusion between his skill and his father's skill, bringing the past generations, the wisdom of the past, the wisdom of his tradition, in with his own new wisdom and skill as a young man. And now it's a perfect sword to kill the dragon. Okay, here we go. When he had been at home a few days, he rode out with Regan one morning to the heath where the dragon used to lie. When he saw the track the dragon made when he went to a cliff to drink, the track was as if a great river had rolled along a deep valley. Okay, so notice the dragon kind of crawls and he leaves this path, and Sigurd sees this. When Sigurd went down into that deep place, then Sigurd went down in that deep place and dug many pits in it. And in one of the pits, he lay hidden with his sword drawn. There he waited, and presently the earth began to shake with the weight of the dragon as he crawled nearer. And a cloud of venom flew before him as he snorted and roared, so that it would have been death to stand before him. Okay, so notice the dragon apparently is not winged, right? It's more of a worm. It's more of a kind of a serpentine lizard. So he's calling forward. Sigurd has created holes in the earth, has dug holes in the earth, so that he can get at the dragon's belly and hide again. So he's using craft, he's using wisdom here, along with having a strong sword. So kind of echoing the Greek heroes in some sense, who use both their ingenuity as well as their skill and strength. But Sigurd waited till half of him had drawn over the pit, and then he thrust the sword, Graham, hey, I was right, it was Graham, right into his very heart. Then the dragon lashed with his tail till the stones broke and the trees crashed around him. Then he spoke as he died and said, whoever thou art that has slain me, this gold shall be thy ruin and the ruin of all who own it. Okay, so another curse on the gold, right? Sigurd said, I would touch none of it if by losing it I should never die. But all men die, and no brave man lets death frighten him from his desire. Die thou, Fafnir. Then Fafnir died. Okay. So then Sigurd was called Fafnir's Bane, the Dragon Slayer and Dragon Slayer. Okay, so we have the slaying of Fafnir, famously, right? Hiding underneath the rocks, stabbing him, from above, and Fafnir's subsequent curse. And it's very Anglo-Saxon kind of mentality here of what Sigurd said. He's like, yeah, if I knew I was never going to die, then I wouldn't touch it for immortality. But we're all going to die, dude, and I'm not going to let just the fear of death frighten me from having what I want. So give me that gold, right? It's very, very masculine, very kind of like seizing, the moment, very carpe diem sort of mentality there. Okay, good for him, maybe depending on your values. Now, Sigurd rode back and met Regan, and Regan asked him to roast Fafnir's heart and let him taste of it. Kind of weird, but we do it. So Sigurd put the heart of Fafnir on a stake and roasted it. But it chanced that he touched it with his finger, and it burned him. And then he put his finger in his mouth and so tasted the heart of Fafnir. It's another kind of Nordic little motif here. Is we see this in some modern fantasy stories, like, you burn yourself, you accidentally taste of a potion, you accidentally taste of a material that's going to fundamentally change you or help you. And so as the result, what happens? Immediately he understood the language of birds, and he heard the woodpeckers say, there is Sigurd roasting Fafnir's heart for another, when he should taste of it himself and learn all wisdom. The next bird said, there lies Regan, ready to betray Sigurd, who trusts him. The third bird said, let him cut off Regan's head and keep all the gold to himself. The fourth bird said, let him do. and then ride over Hinfell to the place where Brunhild sleeps. And Sigurd heard all this, how Regan was plotting to betray her. He cut off Regan's head with one blow of the sword ram. Okay, so another kind of famous sage here. We have the tasting of the blood. So hero's journey patterns we see here. We slay the dragon, right? We face our fears. We face a challenge. We get a reward. The reward at first is the gold, right? The very obvious kind of reward there. But then what is more is that you gain this kind of elevated state of evolution, of transformation. And in this story, it's a tasting of the dragon, right? So you take part of that enemy into yourself. You incorporate it into yourself. You've mastered it in some way. And as a result, he gains all wisdom, which really means he's able to understand the language of birds and beasts now. That's a very kind of obvious archetypal symbol there, right? You slay this being of negativity of nature, this negative power of nature, and you're able to integrate part of nature into yourself. All right, great image there. And as a result, he learns about Regan's betrayal, kills Regan, and the birds then tell him this little song at the end here. We know of a fair maiden sleeping. Sigurd, be not afraid. Sigurd, win thou the maid fortune is keeping. High over Hinfell, red fire is flaming. There doth the maiden dwell, she that should love thee well, meet for thy taming. There must she sleep till thou comest for her waking. Rise up and ride, for now sure she will swear the vow, fearless of breaking. Okay, so I'm not going to continue the story, but as we can see, Sigurd now learns of a princess, essentially a warrior woman, who's fierce and beloved and all this kind of stuff. But she is enchanted into a sleep after having pricked her finger and being cursed into this sleep. So she has to stay there, and she's being surrounded by fires that Sigurd now has to go and overcome to get her. All of my Disney fans will immediately recognize the elements of Sleeping Beauty here. So you can see whether it's Sleeping Beauty, whether it's, as we're going to see, Beowulf and the Hobbit, and elements of like Christopher. I can't remember who it was, the author of the Chronicles of Prydain series. Like again, this early Nordic literature still to this day influences a lot of our fantastical tropes and fantastical elements, and it will influence people in the Grimm's fairy tales era as well. And as you're going to see, it influences the stories immediately preceding it in the medieval era. So very interesting story, very kind of archetypal, very fundamental story for our culture in some ways. Now, a couple quick questions here. We summarized the story pretty easily. How would you characterize Sigurd based on this story? Well, as with a lot of these ancient texts, guys, you don't get an immense amount of characterization. He has ambition. He has a lot of ambition. He's a very, that's why I use the term masculine. He's a very kind of like thrusting, very forward-moving character. He is not indecisive. He goes and he acts. And I think that's one of the main kind of Anglo-Saxon or Nordic things you see here on display, values you see here on display. He also goes after gold. He goes after riches. He goes after honor. He goes after, these great feats. He chases the woman that he wants. He is not afraid of death, right? He openly faces and confronts these fears. So he's courageous in the face of these things, okay? How's he similar to others? We talked about this a little bit. We mentioned how he is using his ingenuity as well as his skill, how he conquers his fear. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of those very basic heroic elements that we saw in the Greek stories. And we also said how he's different, right? He's a little bit different because he's a bit more, I don't want to say brutal, but he's a bit more simple in that sense. He has very single-minded, or as the Bible would say, pure of heart, right? He knows what his will wants and he goes for it, okay? Now, of course, we can tell what the Scandinavians value, therefore. It's simple like we did with Odysseus, Hercules, and Achilles. You want to know what the Greeks value, you take all the positive elements of those characters and you shift them into the values of that culture. That's what they value. Same thing can be said with Sigurd here. All of his basic characteristics, especially mostly his positive ones, are what this culture values. Okay, so that's Sigurd. Now, as a nice little side note, keep in mind that Sigurd is going to fail his story. He is going to be a tragic hero, right? In his conflict with Fafnir and his subsequent conflicts with trying to conquer or attain Brunhilde and struggle with the other guys who want to have her as well. He's going to fail. He's going to die. This is going to be important for when we look at Beowulf next, because Beowulf is going to be working again off the soil of this culture, but it's going to be adding in its own unique elements from further south in Europe. Okay, we're going to talk about how that happens and how that essentially sets us up to move into the Middle Ages and how that really flavors a lot of the literature and a lot of the culture in the Middle Ages. Okay. Another fun note, by the way, here, if you are a fan of opera and of music, I really encourage you to go listen to, like I usually, if I'm teaching this in class, I'll be playing Wagner's music in the background, like Siegfried's Funeral March. Siegfried is the German kind of reworking of the name and story of Sigurd. Now, you go watch, if you go listen to or watch or read about Wagner's Ring Cycle, Wagner's epic opera about this particular story, we add in the elements of, we added in Siegfried and other kind of later sources after this one, this element of Sigurd or Siegfried bathing in dragon blood to make himself invulnerable, except for the spot where one leaf touches him on the back, which of course leaves him vulnerable for Brunhilde's enemies later in the story. Most of my attentive students will immediately hear that and think, oh, like that's clearly an inspiration that was taken from the more kind of Greco-Roman version of Achilles' story, where he was dipped into the river Styx and made invulnerable. So there's something, again, archetypally or symbolically going on with, you know, the defeat of some symbol of death or something wicked or evil or something grim or dark, and your immersion in it kind of allows you to be more powerful or more invulnerable to something. So it's an interesting kind of human pattern we see working here, is that not only do we need to face our challenges, but it seems like if we are put through the furnace, if we are put through the trials of life, we end up, and we do it successfully, wisely, and courageously, we actually walk out quite transformed in a very positive way. Okay, so that is, again, in very brief, just a snippet of Sigurd's story. That's Sigurd and Fafnir. Now that we have one dragon down, we're going to move on to the story of Beowulf and all the different monsters that he is facing. But until then, have a wonderful day, ladies and gents. Bye.